Добрый день.
Good afternoon. We're now starting our forum, financial forum 2020. I should say that, well, nowadays nothing is just conducted in the previous forum. That is why we're going to have quite a compacted forum. We're going to have just one strategic session. Within the forthcoming 1 hour and a half, we will be talking about our economy and financial markets and the way they will be evolving within the pandemic. I would like to introduce the participants of our today's participation. Sergey Sobyanin, Mayor of Moscow, Anton Sivanov, Mayor of the Finance, and Andrei Kostin, Head of the VTB Bank, and Madame Nabiolna. Well, it's really nice to see you here within the offline format and to talk about the most important problems right now. But before we start our discussion, I would like also to say that the head of our administration, I mean the Russian one, also decided to address us. Mr. Mishustin, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to the Moscow Financial Forum. Nowadays, it's taken place within the online forum. I think that regardless of the situation and coronavirus, we will still have a chance to communicate with each other. Digital technologies are changing our lives nowadays, and digital services now competing with our conventional means of communication. And we can see that, well, this year was one of the most complicated one over the past decade because we were impacted by two shocks because we were quite limited in terms of the supply, and also we had some problems with the demand as well, and we had to comply with all those requirements related to social distances. And despite some negative predictions, we should say that the recession was not as harsh as in other countries. But as for the recovery process right now, they are even more dynamic. Well, first and foremost, to the prompt decisions taken by the president and the administration, and also participation of different business spheres, including business elites. So the government took quite a number of different steps in order to really take very optimum actions. Well, we had some very good offers regarding rent lease, regarding taxes, etc., and licenses. Some of them were really prolonged. Well, we should say that we helped a lot small and medium-sized enterprises as well as other participants of the market. Apart from that, we also can see that some assistance was rendered to other market players. We saw a real recession in April, but right now we can see that demand and supply has been on the rise as well as turnover in many segments of the business. The situation in the labor market is also quite stable. I'm pretty sure that considering the situation right now, I think that we have something to discuss, and the Russian government right now has certain priorities guiding us and telling us where we're supposed to move forward. The president outlined the major goals, and we should truly comply with that. We should comply with new initiatives and understand that we should supposed to support huge investment projects and also think more about capital expenditures. We need to think about a legislative basis and the way it should be reinforced and strengthened. We need to integrate it in our national agenda and also create new tools to support some points of development. And in order to improve our investment climate, we will also be focusing on the banking segment and many other domains. I think that some of the conference can be organized online. Certainly there will be some digital space within the construction area and many other spheres, and we will be supporting the SMEs further on, which is really important, not only for the economical development in general, but also for our welfare as well. I think that thanks to our joint efforts, all these plans will come true. And taking advantage of this opportunity, I would like to congratulate on the professional holiday, the Day of the Financial Experts, all those working within the financial markets and well, working in this domain in general, I think this is people very important, and I hope that they will also participate actively in our today's discussion. Well, absolutely sure that we should congratulate our financial experts on that. I think that within the forthcoming 1 hour and a half, we will have a chance to discuss all that. Well, discussion probably will also be quite intense, but at the same time, we need to draw some results and to summarize the works that have been accomplished. We can already talk about some results and to think about our economy and the way we are going to evolve in the near future. Speaking about the economy, yes, we have already heard about some of the major economic parameters. And we should say that right now we are pretty similar to the results that we had in 2019. But let's take a look at how the situation developed well recently, and also think about some specific economic indicators and specifically related to pandemic. And after that, we'll start our discussion. Pandemic COVID-19 virus. We need to prevent the propagation of the virus, and thus we are imposing some economic restrictions. Because we understand that the lives of human beings are more important than the economy itself, and as a result, threats COVID-19 our world, changing the global GDP by percent, 3.4, 3.9, etc. And we can see minus 4.9. Fight against the virus, assistance to the population, massive testing. Top countries regarding the number of the tests, we can see Russia, the United States, Australia, Great Britain, healthcare system, and strengthen of the system, new medical centers, equipment, and new payments or fees meant specifically for the doctors. The number of new real cases per day per 1,000 people of the population. Information over the past 7 days. China, Italy, France, Switzerland, Brazil, Spain, Germany, United States, and Russia. Payments for families with kids to support them. Credit holidays. Unemployment. United States, Norway, European zone, Russia. Retail, percent. China, United States, European zone, Great Britain, Russia. Anti-crisis measures, fight against the virus, assistance to the population. Industries that have been particularly impacted by the situation. Special programs to support them. particular assistance for self-employed people, and partial compensation for all the expenses related to the fight against coronavirus. As a result, we can see changes in the global GDP for the second quarter 2020 in percent: Spain, Great Britain, France, Italy, European Zone, Germany, United States, and Russia. COVID-19, the global around us, anti-crisis programs, fast recovery, and growth of the debt burden. Developing countries, state debt, GDP, new level of the healthcare system, remote working, GDP growth rate, GDP growth rate, general national plan, fact, prediction prior to the pandemic and after that, national development plans and goals. Russian economy and financial markets. Is there a lie of the pandemic? Moscow Financial Forum. So it's really glad that we have a direct answer to that. There is certain life of the pandemic. Sergei Semyonovich, if you don't mind, I would like to address the first question to you. Apparently that big cities are quite in the epicenter of the crisis. And, well, as for the Russian situation, and we understand that a lot dependent on the actions taken at different levels. We should see that there has been certain rigidity of the measures taken in Moscow. But at the same time, a lot of measures were initiated exactly by Moscow, not by other regions, etc. At the Moscow High School of Economics, they had their own assessment of the situation. And I should say that Moscow is one of the top 3 cities that was particularly involved in the fight against the coronavirus, and also 2 other cities in the Asian regions, which was also mentioned and covered throughout different discussions. Here is my question for you. What about your attitude? What was your strategy? Because certain rigid measures were taken. What kind of plans do you have regarding the recovery process? Because we understood that economy was directly affected by all those measures. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nikolai. I would like to congratulate our financial experts, yes, and to extend my congratulations to them, because their role is really crucial and important, especially when it comes to the crisis periods. And well, I should say that when everything is fine with credits and the banking service is quite stable and everything is fine, and you hardly notice that. But when something goes wrong and we actually lack this assistance, then we understand what kind of role they actually play in our lives. We have been through a big number of different crises, but inevitably, the first problem, the first questions, the first challenges I always address to those financial experts. I should say that all our hopes regarding sustainability, recovery, and survival in general, first and foremost, they are addressed to financial experts. What is next? What kind of measures are we supposed to take in order to really make through all those harsh times? What about the budget? What about the markets? Are they going to collapse or not? What about our obligations that we have already taken on? And what is going to happen with us tomorrow? Well, whatever. And that is why I should say that financial expert is a great professional. We have a lot of experts of that kind in Moscow, including financial companies, different banks, well, the central bank and the Minister of Finance and different state services and companies working in this particular domain, which represents a huge network. And of course, they provide for a certain level of stability within the city. As for the pandemic, I should say that, of course, it impacted all the sectors. And so this is quite a unique crisis.
This is uniqueness about this crisis, and this is different from the fall of the oil prices. So, well, the price fell, but something else is working. Well, it's hard, but it's not a disaster. Well, if for some reason the construction industry fell, it's also a local problem. Or, let us say, some other issues occur, but when it happens simultaneously with everything, demand for energy sources and fall of prices, construction, stop of industry development, closing of different objects of culture, sport, food, tourism, hotels, trade, and so on and so forth. In a large city, all the sectors were hit. And, well, it looks like we have nothing to balance upon, because when we have some problems in one sector, you can compensate it with the benefit of another sector. But when it happens simultaneously, you cannot compensate that anyhow. The only thing is to turn for gold and currency reserves. Just help save us. This is the story. I'm sorry to interrupt. Moscow provided quite a lot of amounts of assistance, of help, actually. Well, naturally, we are very grateful for the decision of President and the government for taking measures of economical support, but we also had some resources, reserves, capabilities, and the need to support and add to federal measures by our regional measures, specific payments to citizens. It should be higher in Moscow because the life is more expensive here in Moscow. That is why we took decisions like that. And crediting business, we implemented our own program to provide loans for businesses. It's also a right story. But the main thing is that is in your question as to the rigidness of these measures. Well, the measures should not be weak. They should be adequate to the situation of medical and sanitary sphere and also economical situation. The complexity of this kind of decision consists in the point that it's not polar, but you should consider all the factors. Because if we get into the sanitary story, there are no problems at all. We just close everything, everybody stays at home, and we sit for half a year, and no problems. So the city is sterile, no disease. But sterile city from the point of view of employment, economy, salaries, incomes of citizens, and so on and so forth. And it's not clear what's more fearful. And taking decision, you should take such a decision which would provide for managing of pandemic, capability of healthcare system to adequately react to challenges and provide security of life and health of people. On the other hand, this is an opportunity to work for the companies who can continue their work under these conditions. And taking this decision, we decided that we should come to a compromise. Well, different to the colleagues who took decisions in Wuhan, which was shown where everything was closed and there were troops in the streets, and the life completely stopped for a couple of months until it was totally cleaned up. Or the Sweden, well, they said, no, we can do everything. Economy is first and foremost, and they got huge mortality rate. We got minimum mortality rate at maximum capability for the business to continue working. 80% of people in Moscow continued working, either distant or offline. And this is the promise of painless overcoming the crisis with a high going to growth. And that is actually the quintessence of the decisions we've made. And while taking this decision, you should be capable to perform those. You can take any kind of decisions, but you should make these decisions be performed. And in a city with a 20 million population to control and to keep track of and to provide for the performance is extraordinarily complicated. And also such decisions which are kind of adjusting. These people can go out, these can't. This is self-isolation, lockdown, and these can go through the city or not. These are hardest managerial decisions without any information basis, without operating of transport complex, without operation of healthcare, without social services operation, without housing services and construction services. It's impossible because these services should work all together as a clock in the same team. Only then they will be effective. Sergei Semyonovich, I would like to specify. Looks like this is task for optimization. Well, we should have implemented such number of limitations, such economical measures, so that healthcare system would cope first and foremost. Does it mean that at conventional second wave, when healthcare system is more prepared, we will not need to have the same strict measures, that they will be adequate measures which will be milder? Well, I believe that even the rate of infection is higher, which is quite probable in autumn and winter period. We should go through with the minimum limitations related to limitations to economy, moving around the city and so on and so forth, with the minimum limitation. But at the same time, we should comply with the requirements provided by the doctors. Well, if they have stated that trade should be done with masks and gloves, it should be complied with. If we should use masks and gloves in transport, the same should be done. These minimal requirements should be complied with so that we protect ourselves from something worse. Well, and from the point of healthcare, it's not the question of the number of healthcare units, but the capabilities. We have already worked out the technology of treatment, medicine, prevention, and also a vaccine development. Even though it's not in a high scale, I believe that within a couple of months we'll have more and more vaccine available for citizens. I hope that in December or January we'll have a mass vaccination of population, which will put an end to a pandemic and the challenges we have faced. And Anton Germanovich, it was just mentioned that the federal expenses grew by 3 billion related to pandemic, and regardless of the fall of income, it's an important thing. And during this crisis, lots of financial and economical institutions chose quite an untraditional way. For instance, Ministry of Finance, which has always been very careful about scarce of budget, permitted quite considerable scarce of budget. Well, and in general philosophy, your general relation of such a thing as scarce of budget can also be changed. What do you think? Well, thank you. Actually, I agree with Sergei Semyonovich. When we discuss such challenges which the country faces, then the question where to search for resources, how many resources are required, is one of the most important, and how to correctly manage these resources. And we really had to move away from the principles, rules which we were headed by before. We were ready for oil prices falling. We were ready for some external influences. We have already got used to live in limitations. However, these kind of challenges, when whole sectors of economy were locked down, when people for the purposes of saving their health had to stay at home, and well, not limiting themselves by their incomes, and they limited themselves with their expenses. Nobody could have imagined that, and the budget financial policy should have reacted. In which way? Well, we had to dramatically decrease borrowings. We had to apply for our security sphere in national foundation, and we had to single out priorities among our expenses, and the scares of the budget will be like 4%, that is gross domestic project, and we expected deficit less than 1% of GDP, and we concentrated all the resources so that to react in a good way, and this reaction was in three main directions. First of all, we helped unemployed people, we helped families with children who needed our support most of all. We helped people who really long for the attention of this state. We helped healthcare. We provided additional resources to create special places to cure this disease. We lacked places in the active hospitals, and in order to cure this new disease which we have faced. And direction number 3 is support of the business. Business was stopped administratively. However, we should provide support to business. There was the direct grant assistance, credit assistance, and also tax benefits and number of other measures of support which we all know about that required money. And that is absolutely clear that we have changed our financial policy. We have increased borrowings. I would like to repeat once again, we spent the means of a national foundation, and we increased resources from other directions. We purchased Sberbank, and we have put all the efforts to arrange the economical and population support. And I believe that we did well in the sectors and in the positions which really needed that help. And we have just seen the video. The situation with the growth tempos is one of the best here in Russia. It's not bad. And if in some countries the economy falls down by 5% or more in comparison to the previous year, this year we can see that the economy is going to fall less than 4%, and maybe it will be even better, even more positive data for the economy. We see that unemployment grew not by times like in the USA, where it made 15%, and here it's 6.3%. We see that now unemployment is in the positions, and it is reaching the trends which we had before pandemic, and the industry. So we see the situation with the incomes of the population, and the consumer demands is recovering. So the state measures which were taken actually hit the point as to the sectors which really needed support. And I believe that here the issue of changing the policy, the financial policy, is worth providing a softer going through all these challenges. But it does not mean that we are going to do the same thing again. We have made plans how to enter a regular, normal budget rhythm, budget process. In 2022 we'll reach budget rules. Now we have prepared a budget for the next 3 years, where we step by step go to normal financial principles, financial rules. And I believe that it's very important to be seen and to be heard by investors who invest in our economy, who purchase our stocks and bonds, and this is actually a good idea for the business which is going to work in Russia. Anton Germanovich, if I were a skeptical person, I would use totally standard words to respond. Well, actually, we have a very specific labor market and unemployment market, but at the same time, we reached the consolidation of budget. Are there any risks related to the fact that we are late with the fiscal policy strengthening? By the budget, we reacted to general situation in the economy. Private demand went down dramatically, and at that point we had to substitute it by the state demand. But we see that private demand is recovering, and the measures of state support should be reduced. It can't be done rapidly because rapid going out from the state stimulation can be dramatic for economic overall.
So that is why we decided to take this period of 2 years, I mean half of the current year and also the next year, and starting from 2022, we will proceed to our standard rules regarding budgetary policy. That is why I would like to reiterate again that that was quite an adequate situation and a response where we decided to use budgetary resources and means to substitute for that. Well, I have the similar question for you about the response from the central bank. Well, it was not quite a standard response because we know that usually rates go up when there is certain risks. But this time around, the central bank decided to cut down on the rates, and that was quite a radical solution, and they were quite low. Why is it so? Well, first and foremost, I'd like to say that we acted quite a classical way. We decided to use all our instruments, and all the measures were aimed at preserving the economic stability and also at sustaining, the inflation at a certain level. And also we wanted to preserve the potential that we had. Sometimes we compare the situation to 2014, but I should say that this time around the situation was really different, and that is why we decided not to use increase of any rates, and then we managed to lower them a little bit. How did we manage to do that? Well, first and foremost, we thought about the pandemic, and we treated a little bit different in terms of the macroeconomic stability, and targeting was quite different, targeting of the inflation, and the fact that the government accepted quite a necessary measures, also thinking about the state debt. It helped us to cut down on all those negative spirals, and we know that businesses are quite afraid of all those things because when we have an inflationary spiral, that thing is really serious, but they were just blocked, and that is a good thing, and investors saw what the situation was from the point of view of macroeconomic policy, and it helped us to conduct some counter-cyclical policy. And secondly, this crisis was different from 2014 and 2015. Even if at the very beginning we saw some inflation-related risks, there was certain stress on the financial markets, global financial markets, problems with the exchange rate, etc. But still, it was apparent that the pandemic will lead it to the situation where the inflationary risk will still prevail. We had to think about stores, about global demand, so that was declining against the situation, and disinflationary risk, apparently they were prevailing, and that is why initially we managed to increase our capacity and to avoid any kind of risk related to the measures. And I should also say that we also had quite unprecedented large-scale measures taken by the central banks of other countries as well. In March, if you remember that, there was a financial stress, and when there is such a financial stress happening in the financial markets, we try to avoid all those risks, and especially when it comes to emerging countries, and sometimes it leads to very negative consequences, especially in countries like Russia. But those risks were, blocked, and we managed to escape those fleeing trends. That was a very important battle, and I think that we were quite prepared. So that is why in future we should also be aware of that. Think about our strengths and think about risk and possible scenarios we can resort to in order to avoid negative consequences. Another factor I'd like to mention, considering that here we have a representative of commercial banks, I should say that in our banking service, our capacity in our potential stock was quite high, and we were thinking about our budgetary policy, but at the same time we're quite sure that commercial banks were also able to smoothen the situation a little bit. We know that risks were really grown, especially against the pandemic picture. We don't know how to get our money back, especially when it comes to borrowers, and the measures taken by the government, mentioned by Anton Germovich, they allowed us to really implement that policy in the true sense of this word. This was one of the factors allowing us to do that. I will go back to you with this question in a minute, but something that you mentioned, I have something to ask you about. You mentioned central banks, and it's true that some central banks really revise these inflationary risks, and so they talk about some disinflationary measures, but we also need to think about it in long term and short term. That's apparent, and we might have some double risks or double circumstances leading to a high inflation, but we need also consider that as well, and so we need to prevent those negative consequences. But thinking about the central bank in Russia, what about your target said about inflation? I wouldn't agree, and I wouldn't say that we are now revising our approaches within the central banks because those central banks that decided to proceed to targeting inflation, yes, probably they did it, but at the same time they decided to identify those problems and issues in a more correct or different ways. And I should say that we also decided to revise probably our goals and against such a situation where we already saw a low inflation over the past period, and we didn't manage to reach the threshold of 2%. Still, the central banks has to consider about market risks that probably there should be some more rigid economic policy, even prior when we, for example, never managed to reach it. Probably they will even exceed these thresholds, and some banks they conduct all those reviews of the monetary policy, but they don't do it that often. For Canadian bank, yes, they do it maybe twice or once in 2 years, and the FedEx and Federal Reserve System they also do that, but not that often. We should say that we also had some inflation targeting policy, but it was a little bit different. But we wanted to see how this mechanism works and how it works in different situations. And now we can see that it works both in stable and unstable situation. When we think about revising our mandate, we also think that the central bank is very much focused on the inflation without any attention to economic growth. I think that it's not about that correct. I think that it's not an alternative, and the central bank and the financial economic bloc of the government in general, we have one common goal, which is to create conditions for further economic growth and also to ensure well-being of our population, and we can use different instruments to do that, and also to ensure financial sustainability for further economic growth. Okay, but even when we think about inflation, don't you think that recently there was certain room for decreasing inflation in different ways? Well, I don't think so, considering the fact that there might be different targets and also different nomenclature. I think that this is the right way to proceed without any negative impact on the trust. 4% is higher than in any other countries because we have have different structure of the economy. Our price model is a little bit different. We have quite a diversity when it comes to different regions, and we have a very specific landscape. That is why we shouldn't do it, very harshly. We should think about our economic situation and the different aspects without a very thorough analysis. Okay, I have a question for you. Could you please comment on the situation and also talk a little bit about the banking service and how it actually has gone through the financial crisis? I would say that the financial service in general feels the situation perfectly well. There is a certain difference between the central bank and borrow segments, also portfolio and all those components. What about the interaction between all those components? It would be probably easy to compare all them, but I should say that starting from 1998, so that is the first financial crisis when none of the bank collapsed, and we never needed any kind of interaction or intervention from the state. Just think about 2014, 2015, etc. That was pretty much the same, and the situation was similar. We can see certain measures aimed at supporting the banks. That is why they all survived, and we used all the possible internal resources to do that. And I should say that whether it's stakeholders or the government or some private stakeholders, yes, we resorted to different ways of assistance, but still the situation is quite positive. And I absolutely agree with Elvira Nabiulna, who said that, and said that right now the situation is much more positive. We don't have any problems with liquidity, with all those exchange rate fluctuations between the dollars, between rubles, etc. And in general, we are doing it perfectly well with the rubles. We should say that the policy conducted by the central bank is really great. And I absolutely agree that the banking service is absolutely stable. And as for our emotions or attitude to the crisis, yes, at the same time, it's quite different. The previous crisis, they were quite different. It was about the financial sector, and banks were the first to expose to that. But now it's a little bit different. This crisis is man-made, I would say, and of course it was triggered by the pandemic. By the way, I should say that we haven't been through it. We're still in a pandemic era, and we shouldn't forget about that. We still have some restrictions and limitations related to that, even though that we have already overcome the peak points. But still, the situation is a little bit smoother, and I think that all those things, they have already affected the banks. We started with closing different corporations, companies, borders, etc. In the second quarter, we had quite a problem with citizens who wanted to travel and with the private customers. Right now, we also have some impacts on corporate service. We have some problems. But in general, I should say that if you think about the situation with the debt, etc., I shouldn't say that it has actually grown in size. There was just a slight amendment from 7.5 to 4.8, which is not that much. But Sergei Semyonovich also said that we are just like soldiers. We always need some kind of a war or something to get all those awards and to prove ourselves to be really brave and courageous. And we, just like banks, just like soldiers, we wanted to stay active. We were ready for restructuring. We were ready for specific credits and loans, and also at a 0% rate. That was of great help for the business. And I actually heard quite a positive feedback from banks and from some organizations who really welcomed that kind of initiative. And I should say that approximately 14% of our credit portfolio was restructured, quite a lion's share. And now, by the end of the summer, we saw quite a decrease of different requests and negative feedbacks coming from those initiatives. And that means that we managed to really make it through. We managed to sustain our way of living and to make it to a very good level. Later, I extrapolate a little bit more on the Ministry of Finance and some other initiatives taken by different organizations, but I should say that in general, measures were absolutely adequate. Yes, we expanded some expenditures, but that was an adequate reaction because it was aimed at particular business spheres, at particular industries, and at all those layers of the population particularly affected by the situation. And in general, well, even though that we saw some problems with many industries, but we're all fine, more or less. So let's not put it on the back burner and let's proceed straight to my question. Need more money for helicopters? No, for a taxi. No, Anton Germovich, you see, nowadays I'm preoccupied with a different issue. It's true that for quite a while we have been enjoying some economic, financial stability, and it should be credited to our financial banks, central banks. But now we need to focus more on our points of growth. I think that within the forthcoming years, we need to focus more on national projects and their implementation. And also, we need to attract some private and state investment and private players.
What worries me most today that we actually delay the implementation of these targets, and the second thing, whether we are going to find money to implement these things. And in connection with that, Anton Germanovich knows very well. Well, he is not totally agree with me, but I believe that we could allocate more money for the development purposes, thus also growing internal debt. It's not too big, even with the expense of to something trillions. We have some reserves and different to investments. Well, these kind of expenses presuppose investment into development, and they actually pay back as taxes and so on and so forth. Number one. Number two, as for central bank, well, we have truly created strong and reliable bank system, but today we see that with the falling of inflation, we see considerable falling of a margin of banking business. Banking business is becoming quite expensive, and we are going to fight with that. Today we switched to online systems. So we calculated that in 2019 we spent 3,000 tons of paper, and we actually had a task to decrease it by 97%. And all this measure to cut down additional expenses and to arrange the office system better, and we actually decrease marginalities, and if the stakes go down, we see higher margin, and the issue of banking regulations become more important. With the rating of our economy, our banks have to spend much more capital today to get income than the same European banks. And well, when the margin is less, the balance should be more, and the balance should be growing in condition in international sanctions and increasing the capital. Well, it's quite complicated to do. Central bank doesn't want that, and we insist that transition to national rating scale without the ceiling of sovereign rating is a correct way to move forward from the point of view of banking position as well. We have always been active. We were actively for private-public partnership. Pulkovo Airport, the western diameter in St. Petersburg, this is a unique highway. We attracted money of international investors, Russian investors, international investors. We know today in national project on infrastructure, there was like 3 trillion of private investors' money, but today we do not see any desire from the point of view of governmental structures to attract money to these spheres. An easy example, a year and a half we spent with the private-public partnership with Kazan highways, and now it's outside of that. The capital is not there. There is only state money there, to be quite honest, and a number of other things. So we do not see any projects that the state would offer to private investors based on PPP, and we do not see that we can recover this thing. And we also have an offer to stimulate development of economy. In particular, 1 year ago, I offered offered to get rid of additional tax for poor people. It was not supported by it, but it's okay. And we have transformed this idea. We see that in a number of Western countries, including the USA, there is a system of stimulation employment. When we are trying to make unemployed people employed, to stimulate their interest to work, and one of these benefits can be tax release for poor families with big number of children, or with the children as we stimulate now here in Russia. But we stimulate working people with low salaries to stimulate their moving from the unemployed condition to employed condition. Of course, it can provide additional expenses, but it should be compensated with, well, at the West it is compensated as some tax releases or income tax releases. It should not be done once, like 10 or 15,000 rubles, but it should be done on regular basis. Measures to stimulate economy, which would bring us to 3 or 4% of GDP growth per year, because these tempos of growth do not satisfy us today. The task, which, as stated by President, was made that we should improve the life of population and decrease unemployment and other social issues that we have to solve. If we save everywhere and do not develop quickly, we will not solve this task. I believe that this is one of the most important tasks. Andrei Leonidovich, next year we'll have elections to the State Duma. Are you not going to be head of Party of Social Growth? Well, no way, no way. I'm already very strong in the banking. Well, it doesn't look like that. Well, Anton Germanovich, well, you have some social callings, but to be fair, it often happens that there was an idea to change the structure of taxes like 2020, and from this idea we have only increase of VAT. And as to income tax, we have shifted to progressive scale without compensation from some other side for those who get lower income. And what can you respond to these social issues? Well, there were a couple of sentences to increase expenses. Well, not at the expense of growing dividends from banks, but at the expense of increasing borrowings. And if we increase borrowings or loans, we should understand that we borrow this money from private sector and reallocate them via budget. And we have always considered that the more money remains in private sector, the more efficient economy works overall. Let's see developing countries, high developing countries. Well, the less resources are allocated via budget than in Western countries and in Russia, and the economy is growing faster. And this is number one. And also, it was suggested that we should increase expenses via loans, but we have already done that. And next year we are going to reach the point of 20% of debt as to GDP. We believe that it's not a dangerous level, but we cannot overcome this threshold. It would be not feasible, because we are also assessed by investors who work with our bonds and stocks and economy. Well, it seemed to me that there was short-term reaction to the situation with coronavirus. We have already compensated for that, but we should not continue in this direction. As to income tax, well, it seems to be a positive proposition, but what we've done, we increased the stake and we allocated this money to poor people and children. We have agreed that children who need assistance from government, who require support from the point of view of treatment and so on and so forth, all this money will be allocated to those who are in need, to children who need state support. And we believe that this is a socially fair project. And as related to stimulation of economy, what kind of measures to stimulate economy are going to be taken? I believe that in the country of banking sector, we should decrease the bank rate and decrease the margin. I believe that in the current situation, even in crisis situation, banks will have positive results different to other sectors of economy. So there is an opportunity to decrease the cost of the loans, which will result in the good input to increase dynamics of economical development. And how can it be compared with the fact that you have mentioned a decreased margin? Is there anything to share? And number two, for the justice, well, part of the expenses are on banking sector already. Well, part of the expenses, I mean the programs of support businessing and social programs are normally from the budget, but as to business support, part of the expenses will be on banking sphere. Well, yes, of course, it's out of the question. It's true, but Central Bank and Ministry of Finance were treating that very carefully. And, probably we have even worked faster, and we said that this issue should not be solved at the expense of the banks, and Central Bank made a lower rate of refinancing. And I wouldn't complain here. I think a bank were quite successful here, and of course I agree that banks should allocate dividends and so on and so forth. But, I don't really believe in foreign investments, number one, in the current geopolitical situation. And when we speak about private investments, our economy, a huge role or specific weight of the state is here. And when we want to attract private business, I don't really believe that cheap loan will do that. Of course, it will make the life of a company easier. It will be cheaper to pay back, but the growth of investment will not be provided for that. We need guarantees. We need guarantees for the private business, for its stability and so on and so forth, which to a great extent will be provided by state support. And here I do not really believe that we will be able to solve the task of strong investment without a strong state investment lever in this situation. Oh, well, they say that we are being watched. We have that much loans. I believe it's irrelevant because the capital which is coming in, it's more of speculative nature, and I wouldn't like to take it into consideration. Banking sector of crediting, yes. Banking money, yes. Private Russian capitals, which today understand that they are scared to be in the West. Well, I see that large investment in gas sector, in oil refinery sector, they take place in industries where we need big investments, billions of dollars, and I believe it's very important for the state. That is why I'm all for, in current conditions, to private-public partnership, because the role of the state is great in managing economy and in direct participation in this or that sector. Well, I would like to comment. I totally agree, but when I was mentioning investors, and our debt is 1/3 of foreign investors, by the way, and actually the amount of debt that we are going to borrow this year will depend on whether we are being trusted or not by foreign people as well. And if we do not have private investors, we will not borrow that much money. That is why we need to value this trust. Well, and Elvira Sahibzadovna, an ongoing question to you. Maybe Central Bank will provide assistance. Well, we do not expect assistance from there. As to international payments with the Swiss institutions, which is quite authoritative in international experience, well, this is June research. Well, then like 13 and now a little bit more countries with developing markets started programs of quantitative mitigation, and the Bank of International Payments do not see any considerable effects, but they mention the decrease of profitability. Well, and I would like to remember the foundation scares of budget or something from Central Bank. Otherwise, it's not clear how to support the strong tempos of crediting. What do you say? Well, considering the experience of other countries, we should understand why they pay their assets, why they buy their assets from the market. We cannot apply that non-critically. There are countries which are doing it actively and for a long time, from 2009, but mainly these are the countries which already have no more standard measures of reacting. That is possibility to decrease the interest rate. And well, some countries with the developing markets started doing that more actively in conditions of pandemic, but that was a reaction towards risks of financial stability. They applied this for short-term periods in order to cope with this situation. There are some small exceptions which are quite questionable, and observations question that, and central bank question that when central banks monetize budgets, or like budget grows the scarce, we should borrow. There is no private demand, let the state borrow. But this is a policy which can result in long-term negative consequences. If we consider examples of some countries, the countries which apply for these solutions often have the interest rate for long-term loans, long-term assets, the long end of the curve, as we say in professional language, is much bigger, and it's growing. So instead of mitigating money credit policy, they have the strengthening of that, not talking about bubbles and so on and so forth. We do not have problem like that because we preserve the opportunity to use standard methods, and from the point of view of risks of financial stability, we also have tools which we can apply for that has already been tested. And I would like to caution those. Well, what was offered? Anton Germanovich says, let us not grow the state debt. We have scarce of the budget. There is private debt, cheap loans, and so on and so forth. Andrei Leonidovich said, no, let us increase the state debt. And I would like to remind you that development in debt has some limitations. We saw the risks when the debt burden over citizens is growing, when there are no
but actually the same can be applied and should be used when it comes to corporations supposed to work with all those debts, etc., and as well as the government. And our biggest advantage is that we have quite a low debt controlled by the state. And I would like to welcome the Minister of Finance because they want to come back to some kind of budgetary consolidation, because when it goes out of our control, it can really impose certain risks on us. As for the rest of the situation, we also think about investment and about the capital, the way it works, in order to transform all those savings not only in credit but also in investments and also stakeholders, capitals. Well, this is a multifaceted problem. I don't mean to go into details and say that it's also dependent on the investment climate and so on and so forth, but you should be very careful about that. It was also mentioned about some other issues. I mean, the regulation. Well, it's also important. I don't understand that banks think that the regulation is quite strict, and especially the one that is accomplished by the central bank. But it's just not something initiated by us alone, but it is done in order to protect the means of all those participating in our common transactions. And also we have to understand how to manage all those risks. And even Andrei Leonidovich, of course, well, he mentioned ratings, which is absolutely logical. We introduced some changes in that domain, and we managed to really save a lot on that. That is why I wouldn't say that we are more rigid than other countries on that. But as for ratings, we cannot be just focused on that. We should also take a look at the experience of other countries where they see that bigger banks have their own models where they assess their portfolio, their business strategy, etc. That is quite an advanced approach, and we suggested that all our big banks should proceed to their own assessment rather than assessment produced by third parties. And the global trend tells us that we should really act in this way. We shouldn't rely that much on ratings where these are large-scale ratings, etc., especially those covered by emitting parties. No, we should have our own assessment criteria. Moreover, actually, ratings is an important thing, but it should be done a little bit different, especially when it comes to our borrowers. And we're ready to change our attitudes. As for the margin rate, there is a certain impact right now produced on this very factor, and many banks are aware that we need to cut down on certain expenses and switch probably a little bit more to the digital formats. On our side, we understand that there are certain expenses related to our supervising mechanism, and pandemic actually showed us where we could cut down on these expenses. We are now creating some general platforms of general usage for fast or quick payments, and we know right now that there are certain ways to do that, to optimize our expenditures on that. Still, there will be a certain pressure, but still, as for disinflationary processes, many other aspects, I think that it will make a difference, and I think that margin will be more or less stable, and banks are quite aware of that. But I think that at the same time, we shouldn't artificially increase that margin by cutting down on the bank's activities, and at the same time exposing interests of the creditors and borrowers to a certain risk. But I think that we will continue this discussion with our commercial banks. Yes, it's like that fairy tale by Krylov when we try to move in the directions we want to. So, Sergei Semyonovich, we mentioned such an interesting term as rationalization of the also commercial real estate service. It's an integral part of any megapolis, of any big city. And if we talk about the outcome of the crisis, we look at the retail service and we see that in the big cities, well, for example, the service sector hasn't actually really recovered. What about Moscow? For example, hotels, tourism, and many others, they haven't actually recovered yet, I would say, even if compared to last year. What about the situation right now from the strategic point of view? I wouldn't say that we have any strategical risks involved right now. Pandemic is just a single-time situation, and in 2 years we will forget about that. But when you are right in the epicenter of this crisis, you think that it's all over and this is a crisis, a disaster, etc. But believe me that we will come up with a vaccine, and well, vaccination will work like a charm. We will have some other problems and concerns after that. We will forget about that. As for some eminent thing, for example, when we have to change certain formats and change something in our lives, yes, it's quite a challenge, especially for real estate. But as for the city and real estate, these are not two same things. It's more an issue for developers, not more than that. You have to understand that the more people we have who working in a remote mode, the better it is for the city, because they travel less, they have to reconsider their routes probably, but at the same time it has a very positive environmental impact. They don't use, for example, public transport that much, and probably, let's look on the bright side, it's even better for quite a long time, for decades. We have been looking at this situation, and we understand that we are in a new era. We are living in an era of internet, and people no longer have to stay in the city, and probably you can go to a village to interact with your employers. And so on and so forth. And I should say that at the same time, cities are growing, population is getting more dense, more and more dense, and this will be the trend of the forthcoming couple of decades at least. And I think the population will be growing, something that we can see right now, and this will be some of the most important driving forces for the forthcoming decades. As for restructuring of certain businesses, I wouldn't say that pandemic created. No, it's just facilitated such processes, and e-commerce has been on the rise for quite a while, and in many countries some of these hubs are now developing and transformed in some playgrounds, some malls, some figure skating rink, aquarium, etc. You can see so many projects exploring around. So for example, multifunctional household amenities and service centers, swimming pools, whatever, so many of them. And you know, businesses, they get adapted to that. We see a sprawl of some new services and absolutely new environment, which is absolutely normal. E-commerce for sure will be growing in size every year, and as I'm not mistaken, it has been on the rise and increased by 15% even now after the pandemic. If we think about short term, we should think about other problems. So we're now talking about budgetary concern and issues about financial sector of this year. But I think that our major problem is not about this year, but about next year. Why so? Well, it is as simple as that. Well, this year we will manage to use the fat that we, or resources we have accumulated over the past time, and then we will think about future after that. Just think about 2020 or 2019. Our budget was expected to grow by 8% compared to 2019. But I should say that we are going to have -5 or 6% instead of that. Well, 7% plus 5%, which is 12%. And next year, well, we thought that there will be in a more different place that we're going to have like a difference of 5 or 6% in 2020. But in 2021, we are going to have a budget more or less equal to 2019. It means that the difference between what was planned and what we will receive is 12 or 15% approximately, which is a colossal figure, and no Fed or no resources left. We have exhausted all of our funds. And if the Ministry of Finance still have something to offer, but regions have nothing left, there is nothing left. And here we have no options, actually. What we're supposed to do? We have social programs. We cannot cut down on that, and we cannot cut down on salaries either, and some of the major expenditures. Maybe we should cut down on some investment expenditures, but you should say that we shouldn't do that. Otherwise, it will lead to a real catastrophe. It will lead to a certain collapse, and well, projects we won't be able to execute. Yes, we have to invest in our infrastructure, whether it's 2 or 3 rubles, etc. But if we cannot do that, we will not receive anything from that. This is a problem of short-term nature, something that we should focus on right now, and we need to really think about that. Probably we'll have to enter the markets and to think about some new strategies so that we don't cut down on our investment projects, because otherwise it will also have a direct impact on some private investment. Yes, we want to generate a certain outcome from the crisis, but if we get blocked, then there is no way we can develop in future. Today I heard that the general director of the global health system should get ready for another wave of coronavirus. So do not close those premises in Kommunarka. Well, I haven't heard about that, but thanks for sharing that information. You know, we are living in quite unstable world, and we are being regularly exposed to quite a big number of challenges. You cannot always be ready, but we are trying to do everything we can to do that. We always have challenges, we always have problems, which is normal. It's life. Andrei Leonidovich, it's life. Do I understand it correctly? Yes. So he talked about these kind of problems, about our investment in the financial sector. But what about that technical side? Is there a risk related to the funding developed by the bank? The credit portfolio is now growing. No, we have quite a good liquidity nowadays, and Elvira Nabiulna is quite aware of that. Well, good liquidity, even if we talk about dollars, and certain measures have been taken. by the central banks to attract or stimulate negative factors of the credit. I don't think any liquidity-related problems, no limitations of that kind. Probably some problems with the capital, but as for the banking sector, even though that we are now experiencing some kind of lack of proportion, some distortion, etc., but still the situation is quite nice. And I should say that as for capitalization, everything is going quite smoothly. And apart from that, when we talk about rates, about liquidity, well, it's not that serious. We think more about risks involved when it comes to a certain part of transactions. Also, when we talk about, for example, our credit portfolio, etc., there are aspects that need to be considered. Anton Gemish, so then can I ask you the following question? What about the risks that have been mentioned by Sergei Semyonovich within the budget of Moscow, and how can they be actually extrapolated upon federal budgets? As for the federal budget, I should say that, and it was previously mentioned, we already have certain reserves. We have quite a low debt burden, and apart from that, we have a certain understanding. We really believe that we will be exiting this situation and will be stabilizing our situation in general, as well as the structure. And I agree with Sergei Semyonovich when we talk about federal budget as well as the budget of Moscow. We thought about a perspective of 1 year, and we are now lagging a little bit behind. So we were thrown back by 1 year, and we want to compensate a little bit on that, and in order to make sure that we can provide finances for all the domains, specifically for the social sector. We also have quite ambitious goals regarding national projects and national goals in general, and that was also mentioned by the president. We try to decompose our national goals and segregate it into specific tasks and to work in the framework of national projects. A new plan has been developed by the government in order to attain the goals that have been put forward by the president up to 2030. And of course, we need new resources to do that, and the budget will be boosted for that matter. And of course, we will need to redistribute inside, deep inside, I mean, this budgetary pie. And after that, we will also think about some more massive measures, think about loans. So we need also to think about decent rates rather than going deeper into debt burden and deep pit. And apart from that, we also prepared a number of tax-related initiatives, and we do really hope that all those solutions, I mean, of anti-crisis measures and, for example, rates for SMEs, so they will be there in place.
And we do hope that there will be effect for development of this sector, because this is a really good structural measure to support a small sector of economy. And we do hope that it will also, well, after overcoming the crisis, that it will also be capable of being renewed with a more serious resource basis. And that is why the same problems as were mentioned by Sergei Semyonovich. I agree that other subjects of the Russian Federation have the same problems, even more complicated problems, because Moscow is the largest subject from the point of view of budget provision, and as the situation in regions is worse, of course, they will need assistance. And this year we considerably help regions, and we will never leave them without support. Sergei Semyonovich, you was head of working groups in State Council, and you saw the situation in other regions. Well, to what extent they are ready for these quick measures of reaction, and in what scale they can need support? Well, this year all the regions reacted to challenges in a most operative way, mainly due to the fact that President and the government and legislation provided such an opportunity. There was a symbiosis of strong governmental measures and flexibility of management at regional level created huge effect, because in Moscow pandemic was already going down, and at the east it was just starting. Can you imagine this rigid construction when everybody everything is locked at the same time. Well, we have 7 time zones, so we would not have been able to manage the system, to administrate the system. So we could see it quite well that there should be regional specifics and independence of regions in some issues. The same thing is related to financial administration, assessment, help and economical measures of support. In some regions, sectors of trade and services and hotel business play a huge role in the same way as in Moscow, and we need to support this. And in some regions, it plays a less role, and for them it's more important to develop oil and gas sector, industry, agriculture, and so on. And as I have already mentioned, most of the regions, I can feel it from my colleagues, well, it's quite obvious that most of the regions will face considerable problems of budget nature. Business will overcome crisis and budget limitations will be preserved, especially during some specific period of time, and it also depends on dynamics of requirements of national projects when dynamics of increase the salaries of budget sectors, teachers, doctors, and so on and so forth. These obligations should be performed, and we should also search for expenses of investment nature. And we have said that government is controlling and providing assistance to regions, and I believe next year we'll have to go back to these issues in order to understand, not only to compensate for the lacks with current financing, purchasing of medicines, and that was done great by the government. The decisions were taken quickly and this assistance was provided, but we should also think about development, about further steps to support investment activity in the region. Of course, it should be done. Elvira Sahibzadovna, you know what occurs to me? Specialists paid attention to a not very good combination of fiscal and monetary politics in Russia when both were strengthened at the same time, and it was bad for economy overall. And what I hear from people dealing with budgets, it's inevitable for consolidation for some objective reasons. How central bank is going to act in these conditions? There is some space to decrease the rate. However, are we not going to face problems that other countries already faced? Low interest rate are not that attractive for people. They have some risks, and to what extent we have space for maneuver. Actually, when we take decisions on monetary and financial politics, we consider budget policy, and we take into consideration that the budget is going to be consolidated. And when we took decisions on mitigation, on decrease of interest rate, we understood that the budget is going to be consolidated. But I would like to repeat once again, our monetary and financial policy, they act with a lag of 1.5 years, and the effect will continue next year as well if budget will be consolidated. It will work to some extent. We really said that we have some space to mitigate monetary policy, but it will depend on the way how pandemic situation will be developing, how economy will be developing, inflation rate, and we will assess not only when we use this space, but also feasibility of using this space for maneuver. And the problem of low interest rate, as well as in other countries when they can no longer mitigate, we do not have this problem. We have a higher interest rate, even though at low level, but as related to the fears that the interest rate will be low for credits and deposits as well, they can go down in this situation. However, we're afraid that there will be outflow, but now the interest rate are still attractive for deposits. I hope that Andrei Leonidovich can confirm this as well. From the point of view of the current level of stakes, yes, some people are searching for fund market, and if some kind of money will be shifted to fund market, we have also our transmission mechanism there. monetary policy will be preserved. However, we observe the shifts in behavior of people from consumer point of view in order to take good, well-weighed decisions. Well, does consumer really change his behavior? Because if we see statistics, there are quite huge figures. Well, truly, yes. For a couple of years, a couple of trillions came to market of stocks and bonds, and this is huge reallocation. Does that create any risks from the point of view of deposit base? No. For bank, it's a less profitable part. From the point of profitability, it's worse, but it's also a specific sphere which is really interesting. And bank earns commission fee, and in all the developed economy it's a normal process, and we're ready for that. We have very well developed division which is dealing with these assets. So this is life, we cannot do anything about it. But now I agree with Elena Sakipzadovna, we have sufficient basis and sufficient funding from our client. There was a period when we borrowed a lot from central bank, from Ministry of Finance. Now it went down dramatically because we are quite self-sufficient from the point of view of funding from clients, and it's important that we are totally cut away from Western foundations, and we do not feel any problems as to that. In 2008 there was a huge problem when Western credits disappeared suddenly, and all the largest banks had to reallocate currency to pay for the foreign borrowings, and now we do not have these problems at all, and this is a step forward, as I think. So if there are no comments for this question, I suggest that we should come to finalizing this, and we have like 5 minutes and a small conclusion. I have 2 questions in my mind. Number one, what are we going to have after the pandemic? Well, Sergei Stepanovich is very optimistic, saying that we are going to totally forget that it took place. And the second question, what is the strategy? Is the strategy clear in case of the second wave? Sergei Semyonovich, please start. Well, I don't think that we're going to have the second wave, at least the way it is viewed by many experts, even though I think we cannot say for sure. It can happen in some way, but I'm sure that our healthcare system will cope with new challenges without any additional serious limitations. At least we do hope for that. Regardless of that, we believe that there are lots of positive things from the challenges that we faced, and these positive things, well, I believe that they will remain. Possibility to develop remote work, e-commerce, online education, development of electronic digital systems in healthcare, and actually raising the level of information technologies in the country and in the city. Big number of unnecessary, totally unnecessary administrative limitations which just fell away during the crisis when we constructed a hospital not for 5 years but for 30 days only. So we see that there is still reserve to improve the efficiency of economy is huge, is really huge. And as well as always, our country and Moscow can get concentrated and fight challenges. Well, as Andrei Leonidovich has totally correctly mentioned, we need a strong challenge for us to show ourselves to the whole world. And in this situation, Russia and Moscow showed to the whole world that we can fight and overcome any kind of complications. So, a considerable part of transition into the digit will remain with us. Well, please be careful with the digit. Well, what I wanted to say, I'm really anxious. And, well, Sergei Semyonovich is right. We had lots of discussions about that. There is a very negative tendency that is taking place in development of our world society. We understood that there are 2 threats which are really very strong for the mankind. This is pandemic, because you see, you can build up economy for many years, and some virus will destroy everything and will make all the world economy to go back and to get recovered for a year or two, and so on and so forth, which is a huge threat. And there are lots of viruses like this, and if they all will attack humanity, every year we'll have to prepare for a new one, as World Healthcare Organization says. And of course, the expenses on medicine will have to be increased. Number two, ecology. Well, if ecology falls down, it will be worse than pandemic. We understand this as well. We feel that number three, in the world there are lots of contradictions growing, and seeing what's happening in a number of countries, we do not have a race. We have race contradictions in America and also class contradictions in our society. We also have class problems and conflicts of religion. And we see that overall the world is more full of conflicts than it used to be 20 or 30 years ago, and to a great extent it is related to digitalization. It's related to internet, which spreads negative information, which creates public opinion and brings a society to a more higher level of aggression. I believe that this is reverse part of digitalizations, which we should deal with, because societies are unstable everywhere, truly. And the processes are very negative, and the conflicts in world economy. So yesterday Trump stated that he's going to get rid of a connection to Chinese economy, and so on and so forth. Well, it means new trade and economical wars and so on and so forth. So here I should state, well, good time, especially if you fell ill. You have 2 weeks to think about the future of the world, or even 4 weeks to think about it. You have no contact, so all of us have to think about challenges and how to overcome these challenges, because the world made quite considerable challenges for us, and we never thought about them a couple of years ago. Central bank is always a conservative organization, and we always speak more about risks, and there are really lots of risks. And where they come from, well, we do not know. Now Andrei Leonidovich showed such a dark picture which we can face, but we should be prepared for that. And Sergei Semenovich said that is our life. We do not know what's going to happen tomorrow. So we have to think about this kind of risks. We should be prepared for that. Financial system should be prepared for that. We should remove all vulnerabilities that we have. We recently remembered the experience of 2014 and 2015. We remember how we were cut away from the external market and from international market. So we took this lesson, and altogether as financial system we got prepared to fight these risks. So some vulnerabilities should be removed, but only protecting something, you're not going to be ready. We should use, crisis as a possibility. And I also see lots of possibilities related to new technologies, to digital technologies. And this is in financial sphere. Financial sphere got reconstructed to remote principle of work very quickly. Because financial service, I have recently seen a research, in our country it's on the front end on implementation of digital technologies. It is in demand. It will remain with us. It's convenient for people, and from the point of view of our being prepared, we have space for maneuvers in monetary policy. I have already mentioned it. If we have financial tools, financial risks, and financial stability, we already have this. Some reserves in banking system is there. Banks, besides the fact that they're moving to digit, I believe in conditions of crisis, they also showed how they can work with the clients.
And the crisis, bankruptcy of the borrowers, how to withdraw those debts. I should say that right now banks, they do really understand that it's more profitable to help borrowers rather than to make them go bankrupt. And banks are an integral part of the financial system of the economy, and we have to be aware of that. And now, just profiting by this from this advantage, I would like to congratulate all the financial experts on their professional holiday, and I hope that our financial system will be as stable as ever. Well, I didn't want to say anything about finances or budgets. In fact, I wanted to say about something that will stay with us after the pandemic. We have to be aware of the importance of this live interaction, because recently we have been focused on those digital means, television, etc. And sometimes you just wanted to meet people in person, shake hands, and to talk a little bit, not on online mode, but just in the format that we have previously got used to. And thanks God, some movie theaters and restaurants, they have now been open. And this is something that has previously been under-evaluated, but now we really appreciate that. Well, actually, this has been the fifth financial economic forum in a row, and organizers said that it shouldn't be taken into consideration because it's quite of a limited nature. But I hope that next year we'll have all it takes to interact with each other live and to talk with each other in person. Thank you very much for this discussion. I'm staying quite optimistic about our future and what future holds for us. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this discussion.